Montana Territory, 1868. The howling wind rattled the shutters of Thornwood Station as if nature itself sought entry from the bitter December cold. Dust and grit had embedded in every surface inside the remote way station, a testament to the harsh frontier that had carved calluses on men's hands and hearts alike. Xavier Keller believed the West had no place for softness. At 25, his shoulders already bore the weight of countless cattle drives and the ghosts of too many men lost to the unforgiving land. His face, handsome despite the light stubble that shadowed his strong jaw, rarely broke into a smile these days. Life had taught him early that the frontier demanded a hardened heart, connections meant vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities got men killed. Better to ride alone, trust no one, and keep moving before the past caught up. The blood-soaked memory of his family's homestead still haunted him. 5 years had passed, but he could still hear his father's final words, "Trust no one, Xavier, this land takes everything." After burying what remained of his parents after the raid, Xavier had taken his father's words as gospel. He'd wandered from ranch to ranch, never staying longer than a season, building walls higher with each mile. Tonight, he sought nothing more than shelter from the storm, a hot meal, and perhaps whiskey enough to dull the memories that rode his shoulders. What he never expected to find was her. Gabrielle Evans stood behind the counter, her wheat blonde hair swept into a practical knot at the nape of her neck, though errant wisps had escaped to frame her heart-shaped face. At 22, her blue eyes held a wariness that seemed at odds with the gentle curve of her lips. Her simple calico dress, the dark blue matching her eyes, was worn but meticulously mended, the mark of someone who took pride in making do with little. "We have stew and coffee," she said without preamble as Xavier stamped the snow from his boots. $3 gets you dinner, breakfast, and a spot by the fire. Rooms are full on account of the storm. Xavier nodded, unwinding the scarf from his face. Fair enough. He dropped the coins on the scarred wooden counter, noting how she gathered them quickly, as if afraid they might vanish. "You running this place alone?" he asked, glancing around the cramped way station where a handful of other travelers huddled near the stone fireplace. Something flashed in her eyes, caution, perhaps fear, before she answered, "My uncle owns Thornwood. I just help with the cooking and accounts." She was lying. Xavier had spent too many years reading men across poker tables not to recognize the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her gaze slid away too quickly. But it wasn't his business. Everyone in the territories had secrets, his own rode in the saddlebags he kept within arm's reach. Xavier Keller, he offered, surprising himself. Names were another thing he rarely gave freely. "Gabrielle," she returned without offering her surname. "There's water for washing out back if you've a mind to clean up before supper." As he turned to go, the door burst open, bringing with it a flurry of snow and 3 men whose matching dusters couldn't hide the firearms strapped to their hips. The leader, a man with a scar bisecting his left cheek, swept his gaze across the room before settling on Gabrielle. "Well now, if it isn't the prettiest station keeper in the territory," he drawled, his voice slick as oil. "Marshal Thornwood around." Gabrielle's knuckles whitened against the counter edge. "Uncle Marshall rode to Fort Benton for supplies. Storm caught him, I expect. He'll be back any day now." The scarred man's lips twisted into something that might have been a smile on a different face. "That's 3 times we've missed him. Starting to think he's avoiding us, Miss Evans." Xavier noted how she flinched at the use of her surname, confirming his suspicion that she'd deliberately withheld it from him. "The mortgage payment isn't due for another 2 weeks, she said, her voice remarkably steady despite the fear Xavier could see threading through her posture. "Circumstances changed. Mr. Blackwell's terms have been adjusted." The man leaned across the counter. "He's a businessman, and this route's getting valuable now the railroad's pushing west. He needs reliable partners." Xavier found his hand drifting toward his revolver without conscious thought. Something about these men set his instincts humming like a rattlesnake's warning. They weren't simple debt collectors, they carried themselves like men accustomed to violence. "Your uncle borrowed against this station," the man continued. "Mr. Blackwell's been patient, but patience has limits. You have 1 week." When they'd gone, leaving only the lingering scent of whiskey and gunpowder, Xavier found Gabrielle's hands trembling as she ladled stew into wooden bowls. "Those men will be back," he said quietly. She didn't look up. Everyone passes through eventually, Mr. Keller. That's the way of the frontier. Not the way those men were looking at this place. He accepted the bowl she offered, or at you. Why would you care? Her gaze finally met his, a flash of defiance beneath the fear. You'll be gone with the storm, same as the rest. Xavier couldn't explain the uncomfortable tightness in his chest at her words. She was right, he never stayed. That was his rule, the only rule that had kept him alive these past years. Just an observation, he said, retreating to a corner table where he could keep his back to the wall and his eyes on the door. He told himself he was imagining the tears that brightened her eyes as she turned away. Morning broke clear and cold, the storm having blown itself out sometime in the night. Xavier woke before dawn, as was his habit, surprised to find Gabrielle already stoking the fire, her face drawn with exhaustion. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked, accepting the coffee she offered. "Someone has to watch the place." She brushed hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Uncle Marshall isn't coming back, is he?" The directness of her question caught Xavier off guard. "What makes you say that?" "He left 3 months ago." Her voice was flat, emotion carefully controlled. "Said he was going to Fort Benton to secure a loan, save the station. I've been running this place alone ever since, telling everyone he'll be back any day." Xavier studied her over the rim of his cup. "Those men yesterday, they work for someone looking to take this place. Victor Blackwell. He owns half the businesses between here and Helena already." She sank into the chair across from him, the weight of her burden momentarily overwhelming her composure. "Uncle Marshall borrowed money when the stage line changed their route. Thought he could make Thornwood a supply hub for the mining operations north of here. And Blackwell's calling in the debt early." Gabrielle nodded, her blue eyes clouded with worry. "This place is all I have. My parents died of fever when I was 16. Uncle Marshall took me in, taught me to keep books, to cook for travelers." She looked around at the humble way station. "It's not much, but it's home." Xavier knew he should finish his breakfast, saddle his horse, and ride out. Gabrielle's problems weren't his, and getting involved would only complicate his own carefully constructed solitude. And yet something about her quiet determination, the stubborn way she faced impossible odds alone, resonated with a part of himself he thought long buried. "I need to check my horse," he said abruptly, rising from the table. "Be back for those eggs you promised." Outside in the stable, as he ran his hands along his gelding's legs, checking for any strain from yesterday's hard ride, Xavier argued with himself. Getting involved with Gabrielle Evans and her troubles went against everything he'd learned about survival. His father's warning echoed in his mind, trust no one. But when he returned to the way station and found her efficiently serving breakfast to the other travelers, a facade of calm painted over obvious exhaustion, something shifted inside him. Perhaps it was the way she squared her shoulders when the door opened, as if bracing for those men to return. Or maybe it was how, despite everything, she'd still taken time to braid her blonde hair neatly and pin it at the nape of her neck. "I could use work," he heard himself say when the others had departed and they were alone. "My horse could use the rest, too, picked up a stone bruise in that storm." Suspicion narrowed her eyes. "There's not much I can pay." "Room and board would do," Xavier shrugged as if the decision meant nothing, "just until the next stage comes through." "Why would you stay?" The direct question held no artifice. "Maybe I'm tired of riding." It wasn't entirely a lie. 5 years of drifting had worn grooves in his soul as surely as the saddle had worn them into his horse's back. Gabrielle studied him for a long moment. "The roof leaks in the west corner, the corral fence needs mending, and I can't pay you a cent until the next stage brings passengers." "Sounds fair." That afternoon, as Xavier repaired split shingles on the roof, he watched Gabrielle negotiate with a freight wagon driver over the price of flour and coffee. Her skill at bargaining surprised him. Beneath her gentle appearance lay steel and sharp intelligence. When she secured the supplies at nearly half what the driver initially demanded, Xavier found himself smiling for the first time in months. He told himself he'd stay a week, maybe 2. Just long enough to help her prepare for Blackwell's men, just long enough to be sure she'd be all right when they returned. He never intended to stay longer than that, and he certainly never intended to care. 2 weeks stretched into a month. Xavier repaired the leaking roof, mended the corral fence, and chopped enough firewood to last until spring. Each night, he told himself he'd leave in the morning. Each dawn found him rising early to help Gabrielle prepare breakfast for whatever travelers had sought shelter from the Montana winter. Against his better judgment, he found himself watching her, the way sunlight caught in her hair when she stepped outside to gather eggs, the small furrow that appeared between her brows when she concentrated on the account books, the rare smile that transformed her face when a story from a traveler amused her. He learned she could read and write better than most men he knew, that she had a head for numbers, and that beneath her practical exterior beat a heart that dreamed of more than this remote outpost. Sometimes, when business was slow, he would find her reading worn novels sent by her cousin in Boston, stories of grand adventures and passionate romance far removed from the harsh realities of frontier life. "Do you ever think of going east?" he asked one evening as they sat by the fire after the day's work was done. "Seems you've got family there who might take you in." Gabrielle looked up from her book, surprise evident in her expression. "My cousin has offered, but," she gestured around the way station, "this is home, rough as it is, it's mine in a way Boston never could be. Even with Blackwell's men breathing down your neck." Her jaw tightened, especially then. "I won't be driven from my home by men like that." Xavier admired her determination even as he worried for her safety. In the month he'd stayed at Thornwood, he'd made discreet inquiries about Victor Blackwell whenever travelers passed through. What he learned did nothing to ease his concern. Blackwell had started as a simple merchant in Helena but had expanded his interests into property, mining claims, and rumor had it, less legal ventures. Men who opposed him tended to encounter misfortune. Fires destroyed their businesses, witnesses disappeared, and eventually most either sold out to Blackwell or left the territory entirely. "Have you considered selling?" Xavier asked carefully, "taking whatever you can get and starting fresh somewhere else?" The look she gave him held such betrayal that he immediately regretted his words. "Is that your answer to everything, Xavier?" Running, her voice was quiet but cut deeper than any shout could have. "Is that why you never stay anywhere, why you carry your life in those saddlebags and sleep with your gun beside your pillow?" Her perception startled him. He'd thought his habits unremarkable, his caution typical of any man who'd survived the territories this long. "Sometimes running is the only way to stay alive," he replied, more defensively than he intended. "And sometimes it's just another way of dying slowly." Gabrielle closed her book with finality. "I'm not leaving Thornwood. This station was my parents' dream before it was my uncle's. It's all I have left of them." That night Xavier lay awake longer than usual, Gabrielle's words echoing in his mind. Had he been slowly dying these past 5 years? The thought disturbed him more than he cared to admit. The next day brought the long-awaited stage, carrying not only passengers but mail, including a letter that drained the color from Gabrielle's face. "What is it?" Xavier asked when the travelers had settled in their rooms. Wordlessly, she handed him the crumpled paper. The letter, bearing an official seal from the territorial courthouse in Helena, informed Miss Gabrielle Evans that Marshal Thornwood had been declared legally deceased following the discovery of his remains near the Fort Benton Road. "Cause of death, exposure. He never made it to Fort Benton," she whispered. "All this time I thought he'd abandoned me, but he was trying to save this place." Xavier watched helplessly as she fought to maintain her composure. "I'm sorry, Gabrielle. The letter says I have 30 days to prove ownership or vacate the property." Her voice trembled. "Uncle Marshall never formally made me his heir. Without papers, I have no legal claim to Thornwood." "Blackwell," Xavier growled, understanding dawning. "He knew your uncle was dead. That's why his men are pushing now. They know you're vulnerable." Gabrielle's blue eyes hardened with realization. "They've been waiting for this, for me to be alone with no legal standing." That night, after the travelers had retired to their rooms, Xavier found Gabrielle sitting alone at the kitchen table, a single candle providing the only light. Her ledger lay open before her, but her attention was fixed on something in her hands, a small daguerreotype of a younger Marshal Thornwood standing proudly before the way station with a teenaged Gabrielle at his side. As Xavier approached, he saw the silent tears tracking down her cheeks, glittering in the candlelight. Something in his chest constricted at the sight. He'd seen plenty of sorrow in his years of wandering. Grief was as common as dust in the territories, but Gabrielle's quiet dignity in her pain affected him differently. "Gabrielle," he said, his voice instinctively softening as he sat across from her. She looked up, making no attempt to hide her tears. "He wasn't perfect," she said, nodding toward the image. "Drank too much sometimes. Dreamed bigger than was sensible, but he loved me like his own daughter." Xavier reached across the table, hesitating before covering her hand with his own. The contact sent a jolt through him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd deliberately touched another person with gentleness. "We'll figure this out," he promised, surprising himself with the "we." When had her problems become his? "There must be some way to establish your claim." "Why are you still here, Xavier?" Gabrielle's direct question caught him off guard again. "Your horse healed weeks ago, the roof's fixed. Why stay for someone else's fight?" The answer lay buried beneath layers of caution and fear he'd built over years. He wasn't ready to excavate it, even for her. "Maybe I've grown partial to your cooking," he deflected, attempting a smile. Gabrielle didn't smile back. "I can't pay you, I can't promise victory against Blackwell. All I can offer is a fight that isn't yours and will likely end badly." "Not all debts are measured in dollars, Gabrielle." He squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "Get some rest, tomorrow we ride to Helena." "Helena, what for?" "To speak with a lawyer I know. If there's any way to establish your claim to Thornwood, Joshua Freeman will find it." For the first time since receiving the letter, a flicker of hope crossed Gabrielle's face. "You know a lawyer." Xavier's smile held no humor. "When you've had as many brushes with the law as I have, knowing a good lawyer becomes essential." It was the closest he'd come to mentioning his past, and he saw the questions form in her eyes. But she asked none of them, merely nodded. "I'll be ready at first light," she said. That night, as Xavier lay in his narrow bed, he confronted the truth he'd been avoiding. Gabrielle Evans had somehow breached the walls he'd built around himself. Her determination, her loyalty to this place and the memory of her family, her refusal to surrender even when sensible odds said she should, all of it called to something in him he thought had died with his parents. For 5 years he'd convinced himself that survival meant isolation, that caring for anyone or anything was a weakness he couldn't afford. Yet here he was, planning to ride to Helena, to call in favors, to fight for a woman and a way station that meant nothing to him a month ago. His father's dying words haunted him. "Trust no one, Xavier. This land takes everything." But what if his father had been wrong? What if there were some things even this harsh territory couldn't take unless you surrendered them willingly? The territorial capital of Helena bustled with activity that made Thornwood Station seem like a peaceful oasis by comparison. Mining operations had brought wealth and opportunists in equal measure, transforming what had been a simple gold camp into a growing city of wooden buildings, muddy streets, and the unmistakable energy of a place where fortunes could be made or lost in a day. Gabrielle rode beside Xavier, her back straight despite the exhaustion of their 2-day journey. She'd insisted on wearing her best dress, a modest blue calico with only minor mending visible at the cuffs, and had braided her blonde hair into a crown atop her head. The effect lent her a dignity that belied her youth and the precariousness of her situation. "Your lawyer friend," she said as they hitched their horses outside a respectable-looking office on Last Chance Gulch. "How do you know him?" Xavier hesitated before answering. "He kept me from hanging once." Gabrielle's eyes widened. "Were you guilty?" "Of shooting the man, yes. Of murder, no." Xavier's jaw tightened at the memory. He drew first. Understanding dawned in her expression. "Self-defense." "The law doesn't always care about such distinctions, especially when the dead man has influential friends." Xavier adjusted his hat, uncomfortable with how much he'd revealed. Freeman proved otherwise. Joshua Freeman proved to be a slight man with intelligent eyes and a reputation as one of the few honest lawyers in Helena. He welcomed Xavier with obvious surprise. "Keller. I'd heard you left the territory years ago." "Nearly did." Xavier made the introductions. "Miss Evans needs legal help, Joshua. It's about property rights." For the next hour, Gabrielle explained her situation while Freeman took meticulous notes. When she finished, the lawyer's expression was grave. Without formal documentation naming you as heir, your position is tenuous, he admitted. However, there are precedents for establishing claim through continuous occupation and improvement of the property. Meaning, Xavier prompted. Meaning Miss Evans needs to demonstrate that she has been effectively running Thornwood Station as her own, making improvements, paying taxes, essentially acting as the proprietor in fact if not in name. Gabrielle straightened. I have the ledgers, every transaction since my uncle left, every repair, every tax payment. Freeman nodded approvingly. Good, we can file for a hearing before Judge Wilson. He's fair-minded and less susceptible to outside influence than some on the bench. He glanced meaningfully at Xavier, though if Victor Blackwell is involved, this won't be easy. How long will the process take? Gabrielle asked. Normally months. But given the circumstances and the 30-day notice you received, I can request an expedited hearing. 2 weeks, perhaps 3. As they left Freeman's office, Gabrielle's relief was palpable. We have a chance then. A fighting one, Xavier guided her through the crowded street. We should get supplies while we're here, and perhaps speak with the sheriff about increased patrols near Thornwood. Gabrielle's hand on his arm stopped him. Xavier, I can't ask you to stay for weeks more. You've already done more than. You're not asking, he interrupted firmly. I'm offering. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding deeper than words could express. For the first time since meeting her, Xavier saw Gabrielle's guard lower completely, vulnerability and gratitude shining in her blue eyes. Thank you, she said simply. They spent the remainder of the day gathering supplies and speaking with the territorial sheriff, who promised to have his deputies check on Thornwood when their routes permitted. Though with a jurisdiction covering hundreds of miles, his assurances offered limited comfort. As they prepared to depart the following morning, Xavier felt eyes on them. Glancing across the street, he spotted one of Blackwell's men from that first night at Thornwood, watching them with undisguised interest. We've been noticed, he murmured to Gabrielle as he helped her mount. Ride casually, but be ready to run if I say so. The man made no move to follow them immediately, but Xavier had no doubt word of their visit to Helena, and specifically to Freeman's office, would reach Blackwell before nightfall. The journey back to Thornwood proved uneventful, yet Xavier remained vigilant, aware that their legal maneuvering had likely accelerated whatever timetable Blackwell had planned. When they crested the final ridge overlooking the station, he felt Gabrielle's relief as tangibly as his own. Home, she breathed, spurring her horse forward. Home, the word struck Xavier with unexpected force. When had he last thought of any place that way? Not since the night he'd buried his parents and fled the smoking ruins of their homestead. Yet watching Gabrielle dismount and hurry to unlock the station door, he felt something dangerously close to belonging. During their brief absence, he'd worried about Thornwood almost as much as she had, concerned for the structure itself, for the animals they'd left in a neighbor's care, for the small garden Gabrielle had started behind the kitchen. He was becoming attached to this place, to her. The realization should have sent him running. Instead, it made him more determined to ensure Gabrielle kept what was rightfully hers. That evening, as they sat before the fire after reopening the station to travelers, Gabrielle surprised him by asking, "Will you tell me about them, your family?" Xavier stiffened, the request piercing a wound he'd thought scarred over. "You don't have to," she added quickly, "but sometimes speaking of those we've lost helps keep them alive in some way." Perhaps it was the gentleness in her voice, or the way the firelight softened her features, making her seem both stronger and more vulnerable simultaneously. Whatever the reason, Xavier found himself talking about his parents for the first time in years. "My father was a dreamer," he began slowly, "came west from Pennsylvania with notions of building a cattle empire. My mother was a schoolteacher before she married him, brought her books and her piano all the way from Boston." The memories flowed more easily than he expected, his father's laugh, his mother's insistence on proper grammar even on the frontier, the small ranch they'd built in northern Wyoming. "Raiders came in the spring of '63, he said, his voice growing flat. "I'd been hunting, came back to find the house burning and my parents." He couldn't finish. Gabrielle's hand found his in the flickering darkness. "I'm sorry, Xavier. I buried them, took what I could carry, and never stayed in one place long after that." he met her gaze. My father's last words were a warning not to trust anyone. That this land takes everything in the end. And you believed him, she said softly. It wasn't a question, seemed like sound advice at the time. Gabrielle's fingers tightened around his. My father used to say that the frontier reveals what's truly inside a person. That hardship either hollows you out or fills you with something stronger than yourself. Xavier looked down at their joined hands, her smaller one wrapped around his calloused palm with surprising strength. And which did it do to you? Her smile held sadness but no bitterness. I'm still deciding. Each day is a choice, isn't it? To become harder or to remain open to whatever might come, good or ill. The wisdom in her words struck him deeply. For 5 years he'd chosen hardness, walls, isolation, believing them necessary for survival. Yet here was Gabrielle, who had lost as much as he had, still willing to risk vulnerability, to build something lasting in a place that offered no guarantees. Later that night, as Xavier made his rounds checking the station's security before retiring, he found himself lingering at Gabrielle's closed door. The thin barrier of wood between them seemed to represent everything that separated them, not just physically, but the different ways they'd chosen to face the same harsh world. She'd been right about him. Running had become his answer to everything, not just from place to place, but from connection, from the possibility of loss, from the pain that inevitably came with caring. But watching Gabrielle fight for Thornwood, for her home, had awakened something in him he'd thought long dead, a desire to stand and fight rather than flee, a willingness to risk caring about something, someone enough to defend it. The realization both terrified and exhilarated him. The week that followed brought an unexpected calm to Thornwood Station. Business improved with the warming weather, bringing more travelers seeking rest and meals as they journeyed through the territory. Xavier found himself settling into a routine alongside Gabrielle, rising early to tend the animals, helping prepare meals for guests, making repairs to the aging building. In quiet moments, they spoke of their pasts, their dreams, the books Gabrielle loved. Xavier discovered she had a surprising knowledge of Shakespeare, courtesy of her schoolteacher mother, and could recite passages from The Tempest and Romeo and Juliet with such feeling that even the gruffest travelers would fall silent to listen. He found himself watching her more often, the graceful way she moved about the kitchen, the kindness she showed to weary travelers, the fierce intelligence that shone in her eyes when she discussed politics with passing newspapermen. Each day revealed new facets of her character that both intrigued and humbled him. And each night, as he made his final checks of the property before retiring, he wondered what it would be like to cross the threshold of her door, to tell her how completely she'd changed his understanding of what strength truly meant. But the calm couldn't last. 10 days after their return from Helena, Xavier spotted riders approaching from the north, 5 men, including the scarred leader who'd threatened Gabrielle before. Blackwell's men had returned earlier than expected. Stay inside, he told Gabrielle, checking his revolver before stepping onto the porch to meet them. The leader, Reeves, Xavier had learned his name, was pulled up before the station, his smile coldly amused at finding Xavier waiting for them. Still here, Keller, thought you were just passing through. Found reasons to stay, Xavier replied evenly. What brings you gentlemen back so soon? The 30 days aren't up. Reeves dismounted, his spurs jingling ominously in the quiet afternoon. Circumstances have changed again. Mr. Blackwell was displeased to hear about your trip to Helena. Lawyers complicate simple business arrangements. There's nothing simple about trying to steal a woman's property, Xavier countered. Property requires legal ownership, Reeves said, his scarred face twisting into a smirk. Miss Evans has none, but Mr. Blackwell is still willing to be generous, $500 for her to walk away now today, no questions asked. The door opened behind Xavier, and Gabrielle stepped out despite his warning. This station is worth 10 times that amount, she said, her voice steady despite the fear Xavier could sense beneath it. And it's not for sale at any price. Reeves' expression hardened. That's unfortunate. Accidents happen frequently on the frontier, Miss Evans, fires particularly. Tragic how a single lantern can destroy a life's work in minutes. Xavier's hand moved to his holster, but Reeves merely laughed. Now, Keller, we're just having a business conversation. His eyes narrowed, for now. As the men remounted and rode away, Gabrielle's composure finally cracked. "They'll be back," she whispered. "And next time they won't just threaten." Xavier guided her back inside, his mind racing. "We need to send word to Freeman. The hearing needs to happen sooner." "Even if it does, they could burn Thornwood before then." Gabrielle sank into a chair, her face pale. "Everything I've built, everything my family worked for." "I won't let that happen." Xavier knelt before her, taking her trembling hands in his. "Gabrielle, look at me." When she raised her eyes to his, he continued with more confidence than he truly felt. "I've spent 5 years running, but I'm done running. We'll protect this place together." "Why?" she asked, the simple question laden with meaning. "Why risk yourself for Thornwood, for me?" The answer rose to his lips unbidden. "Because you've shown me that some things are worth fighting for, worth staying for." He hesitated, then added quietly, "You make me want to build something, Gabrielle, not just survive." She looked at him with wonder, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Slowly, hesitantly, she raised a hand to touch his cheek. The simple contact sent warmth cascading through him. "I've been so alone," she whispered, "even before Uncle Marshall left. So afraid to depend on anyone, to believe anyone would stay." "I'm staying," Xavier promised, "whatever comes." The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged with unspoken feeling. Then Gabrielle leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a kiss as gentle as it was profound. Xavier responded with equal tenderness, aware of crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. When they parted, Gabrielle's eyes shone with tears and determination. "Then we fight together." That night they made plans. Xavier rode to neighboring homesteads and ranches, calling in favors, recruiting allies. Gabrielle prepared the station for defense, moving valuables to safer locations, ensuring water barrels were full in case of fire. They worked side by side, their new understanding of each other lending strength to their efforts. As midnight approached, they found themselves alone in the kitchen, the last of their preparations complete. Tomorrow, Xavier would ride to Helena with their petition for an immediate hearing. Tonight, the station stood as ready as they could make it. "You should rest," Xavier told her. "I'll keep watch." Gabrielle shook her head. "I couldn't sleep anyway." She hesitated, then said, "Stay with me tonight, Xavier, not for anything improper. I just don't want to be alone with my thoughts." The vulnerability in her request moved him deeply. They settled before the hearth in the main room, a blanket wrapped around their shoulders, speaking quietly of what the future might hold if they succeeded in saving Thornwood. "We could expand," Gabrielle mused, "add rooms for more travelers. Perhaps even establish a proper post office." "We?" Xavier asked softly. She looked up at him, firelight dancing in her blue eyes. "Yes, we, if you truly meant what you said about staying." He drew her closer, his arm encircling her shoulders. "I meant it. I'm done wandering, Gabrielle." She rested her head against his shoulder, and for the first time in years, Xavier felt the tension he'd carried since his parents' deaths begin to unravel. Here, in this unlikely place with this remarkable woman, he'd found something he'd stopped believing existed, a reason to trust again. Dawn found them still before the fire, Gabrielle sleeping against his chest while Xavier maintained his vigil. He would protect this, her, them, Thornwood with everything he had. The thought no longer frightened him. Instead, it filled him with resolve. Gently, he woke her. "I need to leave for Helena soon. Will you be all right until I return?" Gabrielle nodded, smoothing her rumpled dress. "The Murphy brothers promised to stay close today. And Sheriff Davis said he'd send a deputy by this afternoon." Xavier hesitated, then reached into his boot, withdrawing a small derringer. "Take this, just in case." Her eyes widened, but she accepted the weapon. "I've never fired a gun." "Point and squeeze," he said grimly. "Hope you won't need to, but I'll feel better knowing you have it." An hour later, Xavier rode toward Helena with their urgent petition and affidavits from neighbors attesting to Gabrielle's continuous operation of the station. His thoughts remained with her, worry gnawing at him despite the precautions they'd taken. He pushed his horse harder than was wise, cutting the normal day-long journey to Helena by several hours. Freeman was surprised by his return but quickly grasped the urgency of the situation. "I'll take this directly to Judge Wilson," the lawyer promised. With these threats against Miss Evans' safety, he should grant an immediate hearing. Xavier paced the lawyer's office while Freeman was gone, anxiety building with each passing hour. When the lawyer finally returned near dusk, his expression was grim. "Judge Wilson has agreed to hear the case tomorrow morning," he said, "but there's a complication. Blackwell has filed his own claim to Thornwood, based on a debt instrument allegedly signed by Marshal Thornwood before his death." "A forgery," Xavier growled. "Almost certainly, but we'll need to prove that in court." Freeman placed a hand on Xavier's shoulder. "There's more. Wilson received information that Blackwell has men watching the roads from Helena, if they see you returning to Thornwood." Cold dread washed through Xavier. "Gabrielle's alone." "Not entirely," Freeman reminded him. "You said neighbors were watching the place." But Xavier knew how isolated Thornwood was, how easily Blackwell's men could overwhelm any meager protection the neighboring homesteaders could provide. And now, with night falling, Gabrielle would be even more vulnerable. "I have to go back," he said, already moving toward the door. Freeman caught his arm. "Wait until morning, Xavier. Ride with the judge's party. He's sending an escort with his clerk to deliver the summons formally. You'll have armed men with you." "That's hours away," Xavier shook his head. "Every instinct I have says she's in danger now." As he mounted his horse outside Freeman's office, the lawyer called after him, "Take the South Trail. It's longer but less watched." Xavier rode as if demons pursued him, pushing his horse to its limits through the gathering darkness. He took Freeman's advice about the southern route, though it added miles to his journey. The night grew deeper around him, the moon occasionally emerging from behind clouds to light his way. He was still an hour from Thornwood when he saw the glow on the horizon. Fire. Panic surged through him as he spurred his exhausted mount forward. As he drew closer, the glow resolved into flickering flames emanating from Thornwood Station. Part of the roof was already engulfed, orange fingers of fire reaching toward the night sky. When he finally reached the station, chaos greeted him. The Murphy brothers and several other neighbors were forming a bucket line from the well, desperately trying to douse the flames. Blackwell's men were nowhere to be seen. "Gabrielle," Xavier shouted, leaping from his horse. "Where is she?" One of the Murphy brothers pointed toward the burning building. "Still inside. Went back for something." Without hesitation, Xavier plunged through the doorway into the smoke-filled interior. Heat slammed into him, making it difficult to breathe or see. "Gabrielle," he called, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. A muffled response came from the direction of the kitchen. Xavier pressed forward, covering his mouth with his bandana. He found Gabrielle on her knees before the loose floorboard where they'd hidden the station's ledgers and most important documents. "Xavier," she gasped, her face streaked with soot, her blonde hair singed at the edges. "The papers, I couldn't leave them." "Forget the papers," he pulled her to her feet. "We need to get out now." A terrible cracking sound above them emphasized his words as a burning beam crashed down, blocking their path to the main door. Gabrielle clutched the bundle of documents to her chest as Xavier guided her toward the back entrance. They burst out into the night air just as the main portion of the roof collapsed inward. Xavier pulled Gabrielle further from the building, both of them coughing violently as they gulped in clean air. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, checking her for injuries. She shook her head, though tears cut clean tracks through the soot on her face. "They came after dark," she said between coughs. "6 of them. The Murphy brothers tried to stop them, but they were outnumbered." Xavier held her close, watching helplessly as the station, her home, and briefly his, burned before them. The neighbors continued their bucket line, but it was clear the building couldn't be saved. The best they could hope for was to prevent the fire from spreading to the stable and corral. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I should have been here." Gabrielle pulled back to look at him, unexpected fierceness in her expression. "You came back, that's what matters." She held up the bundle of papers. "And we saved these. Proof of everything, the ledgers, tax receipts, even the original deed my uncle received." A sudden commotion drew their attention. Riders approached, not Blackwell's men returning, but a territorial marshal and 3 deputies, accompanied by Freeman and, surprisingly, Judge Wilson himself. "We were already on our way when we saw the fire," Freeman explained as he dismounted. "Judge Wilson insisted on coming immediately when he heard Blackwell's threats." The judge, a stern-faced man with a silver beard, surveyed the burning building with obvious anger. "This is unacceptable lawlessness," he declared. "Marshal, I want Blackwell's men found and arrested for arson." As the marshal organized a search party from among the neighbors, Freeman took the documents from Gabrielle, examining them by lantern light. "These will be crucial tomorrow," he said. "The hearing will proceed as scheduled." "What's the point now?" Gabrielle asked, her voice hollow as she watched flames consume what remained of her home. "Thornwood is gone." "The land remains," Judge Wilson interjected, "and if your claim is valid, Miss Evans, it will still be yours to rebuild upon." Xavier tightened his arm around her shoulders. "We will rebuild," he promised. "Better than before." She looked up at him, hope warring with exhaustion in her eyes. We, he affirmed, "if you'll have me as a partner." Something shifted in her expression, a new understanding of what he was offering, in the station. Or in life. Xavier took a breath, aware of the others watching but caring only about her answer. "Both, if you're willing. I love you, Gabrielle Evans. I think I have since that first night when you stood so bravely against Blackwell's men." Tears welled in her eyes again, but these were different from those shed for Thornwood. "I love you too," she whispered, "and yes to both questions." As the first light of dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, Xavier sealed their promise with a kiss, uncaring of their audience or their soot-covered state. In that moment, he finally understood what his father's dying words had missed. Yes, the frontier could take everything: material, homes, possessions, even lives, but it could never take what was freely given from one heart to another. The hearing the next day was brief but decisive. Judge Wilson, having witnessed the destruction of Thornwood Station himself, was predisposed to view Blackwell's claim with suspicion. When Freeman presented the recovered documents proving Gabrielle's continuous management of the station, along with testimonies from neighbors and travelers attesting to her character and commitment, the judge ruled decisively in her favor. The property known as Thornwood Station, including all associated lands and water rights, is hereby recognized as the legal possession of Miss Gabrielle Evans, he declared. Furthermore, due to the criminal actions taken to deprive Miss Evans of her property, this court orders Mr. Victor Blackwell to pay damages in the amount of $1,000 for the reconstruction of said station. Blackwell, forced to attend the hearing, fumed silently but dared not object, with Marshal Taylor standing nearby. 3 of his men had already been arrested for arson, with Reeves still being hunted throughout the territory. As they left the courthouse, Gabrielle clutched the official deed in her hands, her expression one of stunned disbelief. "It's really over," she murmured. "We won." Xavier smiled down at her. "Did you doubt we would?" "Honestly, yes," she laughed, the sound lighter than he'd ever heard from her. "I've spent so long fighting alone, expecting to lose everything in the end." He took her hand, bringing it to his lips. "Not anymore. Whatever we build now, we build together." They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony attended by their neighbors, Freeman, and even Judge Wilson. The new Thornwood Station rose quickly from the ashes of the old, larger and sturdier than before, with proper glass windows and a stone fireplace that Gabrielle declared would keep them warm through even the harshest Montana winters. Xavier found purpose in building this new life with Gabrielle. The restlessness that had driven him for 5 years faded with each day spent creating something lasting. They expanded the station to include a small trading post, providing supplies to settlers and travelers alike. Under Gabrielle's careful management, their enterprise thrived. A year after the fire, Xavier stood on the porch of their rebuilt home, watching Gabrielle in the garden she'd planted behind the kitchen. Her belly was swollen with their first child due before the first snow. She looked up, catching his gaze, and smiled with such joy that it still took his breath away. He remembered that night when he'd first noticed her tears in the candlelight, how vulnerable she'd seemed, yet how determined. How her quiet strength had begun to heal something broken inside him long before he recognized it was happening. His father had been wrong. The frontier didn't take everything. Sometimes, if you were brave enough to stay, to fight, to love despite the risks, it gave you everything that truly mattered. As Gabrielle crossed the yard to join him, Xavier took her hand and placed it over his heart. "Home," he said simply. She leaned against him, her head fitting perfectly beneath his chin. "Yes," she agreed, finally. Together they watched the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of promise, their shared future stretching before them like the vast, beautiful territory they'd both learned to call home.